Buildings remember things people forget. Underground, they remember even the things nobody wrote down. Franklin Osei had spent 23 years learning that lesson inside Belmont Junction, a transfer station built in 1962 as part of the city's original subway expansion, where two lines crossed 60 feet beneath a downtown that had changed almost completely above him while the tunnels below stayed exactly as they were. He had learned to pay attention to the station from a man named Walcott Reyes, who held Franklin's job for 19 years before him and who kept a habit that struck almost everyone else at the Transit Authority as a harmless personal quirk: a weekly comparison of the station's original mechanical clock against his own wristwatch, performed with the same quiet consistency, whether anyone noticed or not. Franklin started at Belmont Junction at 35, hired as a junior station engineer during a period when the Transit Authority was modernizing signal systems across the network. Reyes was 58 then, unhurried in a way that made younger engineers assume he'd simply slowed down, the kind of assumption people often made about older men who no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. Franklin came to understand years later that it was closer to patience and fatigue, the difference between a man who had stopped caring and a man who had simply learned which things were worth rushing and which things were not. A clock that can't keep time is telling you something about the building it hangs in, Reyes told him during Franklin's second week, standing beneath the northbound platform's original mechanical clock, a relic from the station's 1962 construction, its brass casing dulled with decades of tunnel grime, its hands moving with the deliberate mechanical certainty of an era before anything ran on batteries. Franklin had assumed at the time that Reyes meant it as a kind of philosophy rather than a literal claim. He understood, years later, that Reyes had meant it exactly as he said it. Reyes kept maintenance logbooks, not just for the station's actual operational systems, but for smaller observations he considered worth tracking anyway. Among them, a weekly note comparing the mechanical clock's displayed time against his own wristwatch and the station's public announcement system clock, a check that had nothing to do with his actual job responsibilities and everything to do with a private conviction he rarely explained to anyone. He left the logbooks to Franklin when he retired, along with a single piece of advice: keep checking it, even after I'm gone, especially after I'm gone. Belmont Junction had been built quickly during the city's original subway expansion, its platforms carved through bedrock and clay 60 feet below street level, its mechanical systems installed with a sturdy, over-engineered confidence typical of infrastructure built to last a century. A 2005 renovation had modernized the platform surfaces, updated the lighting, and installed digital signage throughout. But the original clock above the northbound platform had been left untouched, preserved as a small piece of the station's history, still wound and maintained even after it stopped serving any practical navigational purpose. Franklin walked that platform thousands of times across 23 years. He knew the station's habits the way he knew very little else in his life, which tunnel section echoed differently after a heavy rain above ground, which escalator handrail ran slightly warm near its motor housing, which platform tile near the southbound stairs had been replaced twice and never quite matched the surrounding pattern, which vending machine on the mezzanine level hummed a half-tone lower than the others for reasons nobody had ever bothered to investigate. These were the kinds of things the station told you if you spent enough years standing in it during the quiet hours between rush periods, when the platforms emptied and the tunnels settled into something closer to their true, unhurried nature. Most riders never noticed any of it. They came down the stairs, boarded their train, and left again, the station passing through their lives without ever really entering it. Franklin had entered it, slowly, the way Reyes had entered it before him, and he knew, better than nearly anyone, that the northbound clock never quite kept perfect time. Reyes' earliest specific logbook entry about the clock, dated 1988, read, "Clock reads 40 seconds slow this week. Checked against my watch in the station announcement system. Mechanism inspected twice by 2 different clocksmiths. Both say the movement itself is sound. Drift persists regardless. We'll keep checking." Franklin had read that entry during his first year with the logbooks, sitting in the small station engineering office tucked behind the northbound platform's utility corridor, and it felt something settle into place that he wouldn't fully understand for years. Reyes had noticed something real. Reyes had never solved it. And Reyes had kept checking anyway, patient enough to record a small, unexplained pattern he never got to finish. Franklin began his own weekly comparisons not long after, the same way Reyes had done it, a Monday morning ritual, checking the mechanical clock against his watch, against the announcement system, noting the discrepancy in the logbook, without ever being asked to continue the practice. Nobody at the Transit Authority required it. Reyes had simply asked him to keep checking, and Reyes had never once, in 19 years, kept a record that turned out to be careless. The drift never went away. It held steady for years afterward, exactly as Reyes's earlier entries described. In his 11th year with the logbooks, Franklin noticed something Reyes's simpler weekly notes had never quite captured with enough precision to reveal clearly. Reyes had recorded the drift as a rough estimate, about 30 seconds, roughly 40 seconds slow, sufficient to confirm the pattern existed, but not precise enough to track its behavior over time. Franklin, more methodical by habit, had started recording the exact number of seconds each week rather than a rounded estimate, a small addition to the ritual that took him years to realize actually mattered. Looking back across those 11 years of precise weekly figures, Franklin saw what Reyes's simpler notes could never have shown. The drift wasn't holding steady at all. It was accelerating, slowly and consistently, the number of seconds lost each week creeping upward year after year in a way too gradual for any single month's reading to seem alarming, but unmistakable once laid out across more than a decade. He sat with that realization for a long time one evening in the station's small engineering office, the muffled rumble of trains passing somewhere beyond the wall, close enough to feel as a faint vibration to the floor if he pressed his palm flat against it. If the acceleration had been happening since Reyes's earliest 1988 entry, nearly 35 years by that point, then whatever was causing the clock to lose time had been quietly, patiently getting worse for far longer than either of them had fully appreciated. He wrote the finding into his own logbook that night, beneath Reyes's oldest entries, in the same plain, unembellished hand Reyes had modeled for him, without ever meaning to. 11 years of precise weekly figures confirm the drift is not stable. It is accelerating, slowly, consistently, cause still unknown, continuing to check. He underlined continuing. It was the only honest word he had for what he was doing. Franklin had a theory, in his 16th year, that the drift might simply be a mechanical aging issue. The clock's original 1962 movement gradually wearing down after 6 decades of continuous operation, the kind of slow mechanical degradation any antique timepiece might eventually show regardless of the building around it. He spent the better part of the season researching the clock's specific movement type, consulting with a horologist who specialized in institutional mechanical clocks of that era, convinced he had finally found an explanation that required nothing more exotic than ordinary wear. The horologist's assessment, after a thorough inspection, ruled that out entirely. The movement itself, disassembled and cleaned, showed where consistent with its age, but nothing that would produce a drift pattern this specific or this steadily accelerating. A warm mechanical movement typically drifted inconsistently, sometimes running fast, sometimes slow, depending on temperature and humidity variations day to day. This clock's drift moved in exactly one direction, week after week, year after year, with a consistency that pure mechanical wear simply didn't produce. Franklin had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in the logbook, in the same understated style Reyes had modeled for him without ever meaning to teach a lesson. Mechanical wear theory, ruled out. Horologist confirms movement condition doesn't explain directional consistency of drift. Cause is external to the clock mechanism itself. Back to unexplained. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the mechanical explanation to be the answer. It was clean, containable. The kind of finding that let a person close a question instead of continuing to carry it forward. Being wrong meant the cause lived somewhere Franklin's usual tools couldn't easily examine. Not inside the clock itself, but somewhere in the station around it. The platform expansion announcement arrived in his 21st year. The Transit Authority approved a project to extend the northbound platform's length by roughly 40 feet. Accommodating longer train consists as part of a broader capacity upgrade across the network. The engineering plans call for a new structural support beam to be installed directly beneath the section of ceiling where the original clock hung, requiring the clock to be temporarily removed during construction and reinstalled once the beam was in place. Franklin read the engineering brief and felt an old unease resurface. The clock's drift had never been random. It had been accelerating for at least 35 years, and nobody had ever investigated why an object with no moving mechanical connection to the building structure would drift in a pattern so precisely, consistently tied to the platform beneath it. He brought Reyes's original logbooks, along with his own 11 years of precise weekly measurements, to the Transit Authority's Structural Review Board. The board's lead engineer, a careful woman named Odalise Ferran, reviewed Franklin's records with genuine attention. She pulled up the platform's most recent structural inspection report, thorough, current, and fully compliant with every applicable safety standard, and found nothing in it suggesting any concern. Our inspection protocols check for absolute deviation from design tolerances. Ferran explained, this platform passes every one of those checks. A mechanical clock's time-keeping drift isn't something we monitor as a structural indicator. There's no established relationship between clock mechanisms and platform integrity in any engineering standard I'm aware of. I understand that, Franklin said. I'm not asking you to treat the clock as an instrument. I'm asking you to consider why an object with no structural connection to this platform would drift in a pattern that's been consistently accelerating for over 3 decades. Something is moving it. I don't know what yet, but the clock isn't broken. It's telling us something. Ferran considered this carefully, and to her credit, didn't dismiss it outright. I don't have a framework for investigating that claim within our current inspection standards, she said. But I also don't have engineering justification to delay a capacity project based on a clock's timekeeping, absent any other supporting evidence of a structural concern. It was a fair position, and Franklin didn't have a competing engineering credential to argue against it directly. What he had was 35 years of a pattern that had ruled out every explanation he could test, and a growing conviction that the answer lived somewhere beneath the platform itself. Franklin didn't sleep well through the weeks that followed. He kept circling back to an uncomfortable question he couldn't fully resolve. What if Ferran was right, and the drift really was nothing more than an antique clock's harmless idiosyncrasy, unconnected to anything structurally meaningful, and Franklin had spent over a decade layered on top of Reyes's 19 years before him, chasing a pattern that simply didn't mean what he wanted it to mean? He had wanted for years for the drift to connect to something real, something that would justify the quiet devotion he and Reyes together had poured into a Monday morning ritual most people would have abandoned after the first few unremarkable checks. Wanting it to matter wasn't the same as it actually mattering. He pulled Reyes's oldest logbook down from the shelf one more evening, sitting alone in the small engineering office with a single desk lamp lit, and reread the 1988 entry slowly. Drift persists regardless. We'll keep checking. Reyes had never known what caused it either. He had simply kept checking week after week, trusting that the pattern itself was worth preserving even without an explanation attached to it. Franklin had inherited that same trust without ever fully testing whether it held up against a structural engineer's confident assessment of standard safety protocols. He didn't have the cause confirmed yet, but not having it hadn't stopped Reyes from writing the first entry in 1988, and it wasn't a reason for Franklin to stop now. With the clock about to be removed and the platform section beneath it about to disappear behind a new support beam, he requested, at his own initiative, a single day with a geotechnical specialist before the platform expansion began. Not to delay the project, he made clear, only to understand what was happening beneath that specific section of platform before the opportunity to examine it properly was gone. The specialist was a woman named Priya Anand, who had spent her career studying how underground infrastructure settled and shifted over decades of continuous use. She reviewed the station's original 1962 construction drawings alongside Franklin's precise measurements, and she brought vibration monitoring equipment to track the platform's actual physical response to passing trains over a full day of observation. What she found, confirmed with follow-up analysis using the original tunnel construction survey, explained 35 years of accelerating drift that nobody had ever been able to name. During the station's original 1962 excavation, engineers had encountered an underground stream running to the planned tunnel route. Rather than rerouting the entire alignment, the construction crew had diverted the stream through a drainage culvert running at a shallow angle beneath what was now the northbound platform, a solution considered acceptable engineering practice at the time and never expected to cause any long-term issue. Over 6 decades, subtle settling in the soil surrounding that culvert had caused an almost imperceptible, continuous downward creep in that specific section of platform. far too gradual to register on any standard structural inspection, which checked for absolute deviation from original specifications rather than rate of change over time. But that slow settlement had very slightly altered the platform's vibration profile every time a train passed beneath it, transmitting a fractionally different resonance up through the ceiling mount where the clock hung. The clock was never broken, Priya explained to Franklin, reviewing her findings afterward. It's been faithfully recording a vibration pattern from a platform that's been slowly, continuously settling for 60 years. The settlement is accelerating slightly as the soil around that culvert continues to compress. That's why the drift kept getting worse. It was never really about the clock at all. And the new support beam? Franklin asked. If it's installed without addressing the culvert settlement first, Priya said, you'll be anchoring a rigid structural element into a section of platform that's still actively moving, even if only by fractions of a millimeter each year. The original construction was more forgiving, because nothing was rigidly fixed to that exact point. A new beam changes that. Stress would concentrate right at the connection, in a way the platform's original design never anticipated. Priya's findings went to the structural review board within the week. Odalise Farran reviewed the full report personally and called Franklin afterward. You were right to push for this, Farran said. I was working from an inspection standard that was never designed to catch something like slow, continuous settlement. If we'd installed that beam as planned, we'd likely have discovered the problem years later, after cumulative stress had already done real damage, and by then the fix would have been far more disruptive. The expansion project was revised. The culvert beneath the platform was properly assessed and stabilized before any new structural work began, and the support beam's design was adjusted to accommodate the platform's ongoing, if now properly monitored, settlement rather than fighting against it. The clock was removed carefully during construction, cleaned, and reinstalled once the work was complete. The Transit Authority filed a formal note in its permanent facilities archive, crediting both Walcott Reyes' original 1988 observation and Franklin's 23 years of continued measurement as the reason a slow structural condition had been identified and properly addressed before the platform expansion locked it into place for good. Franklin kept Reyes' old logbooks. He added a final entry of his own before finally moving the collection from his desk drawer into the Transit Authority's permanent archive. Platform settlement confirmed and stabilized this year. Original cause trace a 1962 culvert diversion, documented informally through clock drift since 1988. Drift rate now negligible following remediation. Walcott, you were right that the clock was telling us something. Neither of us knew what for a very long time. He stood beneath the clock on a quiet Monday morning, the first check after the repair, watching its second-hand sweep with the same patient mechanical certainty it always had. He checked it against his watch, the way he had every Monday for over 2 decades. The 2 times matched, precisely, for the first time in the clock's entire recorded history. He thought about Reyes, standing in the same spot decades earlier, telling a nervous new engineer that a clock, which can't keep time, is telling you something about the building it hangs in. Franklin had carried that sentence through 23 years, through a ruled-out mechanical theory, through a season of genuine doubt about whether a lifetime of careful Monday mornings had ever meant anything beyond a private habit nobody else understood. He hadn't needed to understand the cause immediately. He had only needed to keep checking, the way Reyes had taught him, until the platform finally explained itself to someone patient enough to listen through 60 years of trains passing overhead and underneath,